Okay, well, let's start on time, even as people come in, because it's Chicago. We should start on time. Could at least one person raise a hand so I know you can hear me and we're all okay? Okay, terrific. Well, welcome and thank you all for coming. On behalf of the law school, we're all flattered. I wanted to say one thing about what the CBI series is, because having started it at our university centennial, I feel like it's a child of mine and I feel responsible for it. And then I'll get right into our topic, which is a lot more intellectual than introducing CBIs. So here's the idea, is that CBIs are not exactly meant for faculty members to come and give a talk about their own work. First of all, unlike this year, they're meant to give you a much fancier lunch than usual. So I'm sorry you don't have the lunch, but you could imagine the lunch coming into you. The idea of the series, as originally imagined, is that a faculty member would talk about one of the great ideas that came out of Chicago, meaning not his or her own ideas, but something that happened, by somebody who might be dead now, or might be on the faculty now, or might be at another law school now. And it's like, what's going on? Why was this one of Chicago's best ideas? Let's hear what the idea is. And then, as is always typical of speakers, let me tell you its relevance to the current day, or let me tell you why I hate the idea, or let me tell you why I love the idea, or some applications. So today I'm mostly going to do applications, and that's the idea of both the CBI series and of what we're going to do today. Okay, so today's episode, if you will, of CBIs is really, the focus is on the nature and size of companies, which, as you'll see in a minute, is the original Chicago Best Ideas by Ronald Coase. But it's also about why are law schools the size they are, maybe even why families are the size they are, why cities and countries are the size they are. It's the usual Chicago claim, I have a little idea and the whole world can be explained with my idea. And you'll never be the same after you hear my idea, nor my sarcasm or anything of the sort. But it happens that I really like this idea, which originated with Ronald Coase. Most of you, I kind of hope all of you, know what the Coase theorem is, because that's a real law application, right? That's the idea that you might have a rule of law, but then people can often bargain around the rule. That's one of Coase's great ideas. He won a Nobel Prize for that idea and another idea. And it's the other idea that I want to talk about today. And it's about Coase's paper called The Theory of the Firm, written, I might add, by Coase as a faculty member here, though unlike the Coase theorem, not exactly written in this building. It's before the law school came to this building and it was across the Midway, but it was written in that building. But we could imagine that it was written in this building and produced by Coase, and he gave workshops about it. He didn't do CBIs because they weren't invented yet. So here's the basic idea, and then we can talk about applications to it. Think about firms or corporations if you want. And Coase's idea was, why is a corporation the size it is? So there's a corporation, there's some CEO. You could imagine the CEO starting the company's doing well. I'm a real Shark Tank guy, so you can imagine a Shark Tank company. And the company's doing well, and the CEO hires some more people and some more people and some more people, keeps an eye on them, maybe gives them stock in the firm, so they work hard. If the firm does well, they do well. But as it grows and grows, it's harder for the CEO to keep track of everyone. Starts having, what we in the law school call transactions costs. I want to think of them as internal costs, right? There's a company, and inside the company, there are these costs. It's hard to monitor people. The CEO wants to work hard, not keep track of people all the time. They might steal money. They might not work so hard. They might not just be good at their jobs and so forth. Well, slowly but surely, as the company grows, these internal costs grow and grow and grow. And at some point, the CEO might think, I really ought to outsource some of these things. There'll be a cost to outsourcing, because I'll have to choose a company on the outside. I'll have to think about whether they're doing a good job. I'll have to sign a contract with them. But then let it be that guy's problem out there. Inside the other company, there'll be some CEO who will also have internal costs, but at least that won't be my problem. So again, that's going to be the nature of the problem here. There are internal costs to growth, and then you can outsource things. Somebody else might be better at monitoring employees and markets on the outside. So for example, they might hire a law firm. That's a good example of outsourcing. Companies have some lawyers that work for the firm, But when they're sued or when they want to investigate things in law, they often go outside the firm and they hire a law firm, and the law firm has its own internal costs. They might be good at hiring you. They might be good at giving you bonuses. The original CEO of the firm, that is of the client firm from the law firm's point of view, might not know that much about law. He or she might not be that good at monitoring what's inside the firm. It might also be what we think of as more pedestrian. Maybe the firm is not very good at monitoring the people who clean the building at the end of the day. So they might hire an outside cleaning company. Somebody runs the cleaning company. She has to manage what's inside the cleaning company. She has her own costs that are internal, but they're now external to our first CEO who managed the firm. This was Coase's really great insight, that the way to think about firms, the way to think about the size of organizations, is to think about the constant balancing of these internal costs as the firm grows and grows and grows to these external costs, like the firm can hire an outsider and maybe has the cost of choosing the best outsider or relying on the market to choose the outsider or something of that sort. So again, I'm going to repeat it maybe just once and say it sounds maybe trivial, but it wasn't at the time. The Coase's basic insight was that the size of the firm is determined by the costs of running the firm, by these internal costs of monitoring things and growing. When those costs got high, that is higher than the costs of figuring out which outsider to hire, then the firm might switch to an outsider. It might, what I'm calling outsourcing. I don't think outsourcing was a word in the English language when Coase did this, many years ago. Okay, so that's kind of the basic idea. Like, think of it from the point of view of the CEO. We're going to do some surprising examples, and I'm going to try to convince you that it's a very important idea. You could think of, companies, law firms right away, where it's hard for you to picture Coase's insight. For example, law firms in our lifetimes just grow and grow and grow. Most of our graduates, when you think of, fancy law firms they might go to, they often measure these law firms by their size. They grow and grow and grow. And you don't think of the firm as, oh, they've got these big internal costs. How do they know who should make partner? Oh, they just leave and they form an outside firm. So maybe the tax people go form their own firm outside. Although that does happen, we tend not to think of it over there. In other areas, we don't think of Coase as being very insightful. Think about law schools. Compare our law school to very, very big law schools like Texas or Harvard. If somebody says to you, well, why is Chicago a relatively small law school and Harvard and Texas such big law schools? Very few people, including me, by the way, would say, oh, Coase explained it to me with the theory of the firm. Harvard has a lot of trouble managing inside. They have a lot more employees. They have a lot more faculty members. They can't keep track of them. They don't know whom to promote. So eventually it grows, and the dean just gives up, says, oh, Harvard's too big. And then they form Stanford Harvard. They go to the West Coast and they form another firm, so to speak, that is law school. That doesn't seem to be the way law schools work. Like, if we had to explain why Harvard was bigger than Chicago, we would say, something like, well, there's a real advantage to being small. Students get to know one another better. They know the faculty members better. The faculty can all be around a few floors. The staff know one another, and they therefore might manage it better. Everyone's in one building. But then there are advantages to be a big law school. When people go to get jobs, there are many, many more people that are in this Harvard group over there. They might feel loyalty to Harvard. They might hire people who went to Harvard. So there are advantages to being a big law school. Maybe you can offer more courses. You can do family law in Indonesia. That is a real Harvard course, by the way. Well, we don't offer family law in Indonesia because we don't have a faculty of 100 people. We're like a third the size of Harvard or something of the sort. So that's how we would explain the size of firms that we call law schools. There are advantages to being small, there are advantages to being big. In other industries, we would imagine that the size of the firm depends on these internal managing costs or these external managing costs. Another example I want to give about law school would be class size. This is a very interesting one and will bring us to public schools. So why are classes the size they are? By classes, I don't mean like the class of 2021. I mean class as in 8th grade or 9th grade or 10th grade. 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 10 tax law or something like that, an actual class. Think about 8th grade. So you have a teacher, the teacher's pretty good. If the teacher's pretty good, then parents want to send their kids to study with that teacher. So the class might grow. You might think, leaving aside, all the teachers' other responsibilities and labor unions and things like that, you can imagine a world where you have a bunch of people teaching in 8th grade, and then parents or kids themselves want to go to the teacher who's really good, and that teacher grows and grows. And at some point, the teacher's internal cost, you could think of that in Coase's way, it grows. The teacher has no idea who the students are. It's harder to grade exams. It's harder to pay individual attention. There are only 4 corners of the room to send the misbehaving kids to. Like, you run out of an ability to do things. And so maybe some other teacher sets up 8th grade, or parents say, oh, I really care about class size. Even though I've read the literature and I know the class size might not be that important really, still, I'd rather my kid had a group of 15 from a medium teacher than had a group of 100 from the world's best 8th grade teachers. I think that's a close call, actually. I think I'd probably rather have my kid go to the best teacher in the world if there are 100 kids in the class than go to an average teacher with 15 kids in the class. But I'm not really sure. I'm positive I don't want my kid to go to the 8th grade class with 10,000 people in the class. Like, I don't think you could be a good 8th grader with a class that size. So that's exactly, Coase's idea, that internally things grow and grow and grow, and are these internal costs, even though the CEO, or in this case, the teacher, might be very, very good. And at some point, it's better to outsource. That is, to form a new 8th grade class. I can't resist just saying on the side, that's a very hard question in running a school system. Like, we tend to think that if there are 5 8th grade teachers, they should all have about the same size class. The teachers union might argue for that, or parents might argue for that. It's probably not optimal. Probably a better way to do it would be to try to figure out who the best teachers are and give them more students. And then at some point, maybe they would have a class of 50. That's typical in Chinese high schools, for example. And then you might have the new teachers or the unproven teachers, or maybe the just below average teachers, teach a class of 15. That would be a very Coase way of looking at it, that there's some advantage to small size, you can watch the students more carefully. There's some advantage to big size, you give the best teacher more and more students. In our law school, for example, if you say to people, any law school, you say, oh, who was the best teacher you had in law school? I shouldn't have put it that way. What was the best class you have in law school? I have never heard anyone say, oh, the best class I had was X because it was the smallest class. I got the most attention because there were only 6 people in the class. In fact, they'll usually say, I had Strahilovitz. It was a great class. There were 100 students in the class, but boy, he was great at managing the room and all that. Like, we tend to be on the side of, you have a really good teacher, you expect to have a really big class there as students choose that class. Maybe room size makes a difference, but it's kind of rare to have people in a law school say, I don't want to take the perceived best teacher in a subject because I'd rather have small class size. People might say that in college. They might say, I really like seminars. I can't resist but saying, usually when they say, I really want seminars, what they mean is they wrote a paper and seminars gave higher grades, so they really liked that and they got positive feedback. But maybe not. Some people really like small class size. They go to England or something to have a teacher who monitors only one. Again, I think there are a lot of things going on here. For example, we might be very bad at identifying who the best 8th grade teacher is. What I've described as, you'd want the good 8th grade teacher to have 50 students, and the mediocre, you could picture the idea. If you had the best teachers, you could have fewer teachers with high salary. Imagine that there's a certain amount of money to spend. You might rather have 3 teachers teaching, 50 students each than 5 teachers teaching 30 students each. But to make that worthwhile, you have to be able to identify the best teachers. We might not be so good at doing that, or the best teacher for you might not be the best teacher for me, and so forth. I think that's the CEO's problem. Those are all internal Coasean costs. The more we can identify the good employees from the bad employees, the more we want the firm to grow. The more we get bad at identifying who's good and who's bad, who's average, who's worse than average, the more we might want to outsource or just treat everybody the same or allow a teachers union to pay the same and so forth. Restaurants might be a counterexample. Most people think that a good measure of the good restaurant is the one with the long line. That is, they leaving aside reservations for the moment or forever. They might think, oh, if there's a long line at that restaurant and that restaurant's, 9/10 empty, it's kind of a market signal that the bigger one is better. On the other hand, it's hard to manage the bigger restaurant. You got more employees running around, more people giving orders and taking it back. Again, that's very Coase-like. The firm size depends on comparing those internal costs to the outsourcing to a new restaurant, the outside costs, and so forth. Okay. Notice now something I'm going to get to about reversal problems. Let's say you are the manager of a firm and it's getting bigger and bigger, or you're the manager of a law school and it's getting bigger and bigger, or even a restaurant. So you've adopted this attitude, you grow and grow, probably make more money. And then eventually you realize you have no control. You have no idea who's good, who's bad, whether they're coming to work on time, whether they're spitting at, customers or whatever bad behavior is. And then you decide, okay, I'm going to not grow anymore. I'm going to outsource, so to speak, meaning really customers are going to start going to other places. And that firm will grow as opposed to my firm. An interesting problem there is that it's very hard for you to reverse course. Once you're big, it would be very hard for Harvard to become the size of the University of Chicago Law School. I mean, they've got all these teachers, they've given them tenure, they have a lot of student applicants, they have parents whose kids want to go to the school, they have donors who have put up big buildings. Like, it's extremely hard to reverse size. Now, if Harvard is very well run, same with restaurants and all that, you've already bought equipment for a very big restaurant. Now you discover your internal costs are very high, your exterior costs are much lower. You wish you could form other branches of the restaurant or just send customers away, but you've already invested all this money, you've signed leases and so forth. This is a problem in every legal entity that we have. Now, if people are, so you might say right there, oh, well, big firms are probably not so good because probably they've grown too much. And now when they figure out that they're too big, it's very hard to shrink. If you want to be very clever Chicago law kind of person, you could say, aha, people will be disinclined to grow even if their internal costs are low. They might have a great CEO, a great chef, whatever it is. And they might think, oh, I don't want to grow because I know that if I grow and I overgrow, it'll be very hard to shrink later. That's going to be a problem for where I'm going. And it's kind of a clever way to look at it, that maybe we have insufficient growth because there's some optimal level of growth, but people inside all these organizations realize, boy, if I grow, I'll never be able to go back and I might overgrow, or times might change and the growth that now is good will be too much in the future. It's always easy to expand than it is to contract. Families, if your parents decided to have 9 kids, it's a little hard to say, that's not optimal size. We should have had only 4 kids. Let's give 5 of them away. Like, I think you go to jail if you do that or something. So again, one way to think about it is that clever parents might actually have too few kids for what is optimal with their parenting ability or money or neighborhood or whatever, because they might be afraid that they'll have too many kids and then it'll be impossible to go back. I mean, I see some of you laughing, and it is kind of funny to think of that way, but I think there's some truth to that about size and so forth and the difficulty of contraction later on. Well, what about countries? I mean, I promised in the description of this to talk about countries. I don't think countries are like this. I think we have a good explanation for country size, which is about safety. That is, you're a small country and it might be optimal. That is, it might be a very well-run country and everybody's happy. Notice that within the country, you can still have choice. I mean, Switzerland doesn't have to have the same rules for everybody. You can have different cantons. The United States could have different things going on in different cities. So we don't have to all agree on what to do about everything. But the major reason we think why countries have tended to grow over time, Soviet Union aside, is that the country's main focus is, what are we going to do if an outsider wants to create war against us? So size is very valuable. Now you might say, hey, wait a minute, you're violating Coase. After all, we should find small countries because they can monitor inside, and then they should outsource, national defense. They should hire some country or some outsider to defend themselves. I think you're familiar with this already. The problem is it's very hard to guarantee that the outsider will do your work. I mean, the war might be too dangerous, or the country they come from might want to do war against you. So there is some outsourcing, sometimes to the United States, by the way, which seems to be in the business of protecting other countries. Sometimes it's independent employees, although now international conventions disallow that. You're not allowed to hire employees from other countries to be your national defense. I don't know why. It seems a little crazy to me offhand. But outsourcing is sort of hard with national defense. So if somebody has to explain why we have small countries over there and large countries over there, I don't think Coase will enter the explanation. I think it's more about safety and diversity and common language or things like that. So I don't want to claim that Coase's idea about internal and external costs apply to everything. Okay, I think you get the idea, and I want to leave lots and lots of times for questions. That's my nature. So get your questions ready. But, I think, let me sort of conclude and wrap up without going to other examples. I think Coase is really onto something. Like what he's onto is that we should always be comparing the internal and the external costs. What he's not onto, I think, is something like it's very hard to reverse. So you grow, but then it's hard to go back. So maybe when we look at the world and we see small firms and big firms, we shouldn't say, oh, that's completely explained by Ronald Coase. We should say, well, Coase sets the pattern, but then maybe people were afraid to expand, or maybe other people expanded and now it's impossible to contract. That's what people usually say about schools and unions. They'll say, oh, well, maybe we actually should outsource more schooling to private schools or charter schools or something, but the teachers union, gets in the way, or we don't deliver the mail very well. We should have much more FedEx, but no, we've got the post office over there with a lot of political power. So we have explanations of why it's hard to shrink. We also have an explanation of why people might be reticent when it comes to growing. Those are kind of public choice questions. You could take a course in that, I hear, at our small law school. We offer a course in public choice. So I don't really want to go there today, but you can see the problem that maybe a good explanation, Coase, on top of Coase, is that when we think of firm size, big and small, we should think, some of them are not growing as big as they should because they're afraid they won't be able to contract. Others are probably too big than they should because they can't contract because of unions or other things or political power or something of the sort. I've cheated, and I do want to give another example very, very close to home that is close to law before winding up. And that's, the size of judges, if you will. Like, why do we have the number of courts that we do? Why do we have the number of judges that we do? So one way to think about it would be to say, wow, we should find, it's like schools. We should find really good judges. And then we should say to those judges, we're going to give you a lot of cases. You could be Cardozo, you could be Posner. We'll send you 500 cases a year. And even though you'll only spend, half an hour on each case or whatever it boils down to, we're confident that you'll do a better job than giving a mediocre judge 70 cases a year. So think about that for a moment. I think that really wouldn't be bad. In some jurisdictions, the judges on purpose get equal number of cases. In many jurisdictions, the judge who's quick can take on most cases. Although it's hard to know whether the judge who says, give me more cases, is really the best judge. I'm confident that I'd rather live in a jurisdiction that gave Posner, Easterbrook, Wood, many, many more cases than other judges get. I know they're associated with this law school, but I think they really are the three best judges on the Seventh Circuit, or were since Posner's retired. But I really would give them many, many cases, just as I might send my kid to the best math teacher in 8th grade, even though that teacher had 50 students rather than 15 students, or whatever my earlier example was. So that would be a possibility that we could do with courts what I think Coase would suggest. Identify the good judges, send them more cases. I guess we'd have to tell them, we're going to have to give you more precedential value, because the whole point is that you will decide cases better than other lower court judges will have to follow what you say. So try to come up with precedents that are not too fact specific. Try to come up with general precedents that will apply to many, many cases, because we don't want to send you 10,000 cases. We're only going to be able to send you a few hundred, but they're going to apply to many, many lower court opinions. that might be pretty clever. In other words, it might be that when Posner got a case, he had his eye on the fact that he would be followed in precedential value by lower courts. So therefore, he tries to come up with rules that really will apply to many, many cases. If he knew that his rules would be applied by many, many more judges, then he might make his rules more specific to the fact situation. Well, why don't we do this? I think the answer is kind of obvious to you after you've been in law school even a few weeks, which is it's very hard to identify the good judges, the medium judges, and the bad judges. I mean, my suggestion is something like, instead of having 700 circuit court judges, we really should find the best of them and have only 350 of them. You know, keep the firm size small, if you will. Let's have 350 circuit court judges instead of twice that number. Give them each more cases, maybe pay them more money or whatever it would take to get them there. And then it would be like schools. It would be like the University of Chicago Law School. We're smaller than Harvard, but we're convinced, and maybe you were by coming here, I'm certainly convinced that our average professor is vastly better than the average professor at Harvard. That stands to reason. Their best professors are probably as good as our best professors. You know, that's fine. Maybe they're even better. You know, that would be fine for my theory or for Coase's theory. I don't think they're better, but I'll just say that to act, you know, open-minded. But their average almost surely is worse than our average because they can't really monitor them carefully. And they've got a lot of students. They've got to staff the whole place and so forth. So small size might really be a benefit, as we've seen, even though it has some cost. The same thing could be true of judges. The problem is that it's very hard to evaluate judges, especially at the beginning. We need to decide this when we hire them. Really hard to know who will be made a great judge, who will turn out to be excellent. So I don't think we can really apply Coase to judges, though it would be kind of an interesting idea, like hire judges for a 2 or 3 year basis, see how they do, and then get rid of the bottom half, keep the top half, pay them more money, give them more cases, and so forth. I think that would be very cool. Again, we don't do that. So I think the message of Coase that if you take one thing away from this talk before questions, I think you should take away that we should always be thinking about firm size. By firm, I mean the size of families, to the size of government, to the size of courts, to the size of everything. Should always think about it. Do we want them to expand, or do we think the cost of expansion by the best behaving firms is really too great compared to outsourcing? Sometimes outsourcing is probably underdone. Sometimes outsourcing is overdone. And that's what I think we want to think about. And as for you personally, I think you need to think very hard about when you outsource and when you insource. So let's pause there. I'm very eager to take questions, but I think your job is to raise your blue hand or green hand or whatever color you think it shows up on your computer. And when I call on you, don't be shy. When I call on you, then please unmute and scream loudly if it's not working very well. Okay, I see a few hands up. Ed, why don't you, can you all see the same list I see? I don't know. Oh, you can. Well, Alex, I guess I better call on you first in front of Ed then, because everybody could see that your hand was up first. Ed, don't go away. Alex, please. So are you unmuted now?
Yes. Hi. Thanks for giving this talk. I think it's really interesting. I wonder if there's been research about how separate the outsourcing has to be for it to make a difference. So, for example, like a conglomerate, has different, sort of like sub businesses that aren't fully separated, or maybe you spin off part of your firm, but you still own a majority of the shares in the spun off firm. Like, how separate does it have to be for there to be efficiencies gained?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to rephrase the question and then answer it because I'm not sure everybody followed it, but it's a major topic in corporate law theory and actually comes out of our business school, not our law school, for its solution. So the question sort of was, well, what's really the line? I mean, if you have a conglomerate that has within it many, many companies, I think the question is, that's not really outsourcing. That's some excellent manager who is now, that's like Warren Buffett, who's now managing many, many companies under him. He's advising them, so to speak. So do you want to call that outsourcing or insourcing? Did I get the question more or less right? Okay. Well, that's actually a very interesting topic in theory. So let me give you a short answer started with a little history. When I was a kid, there were many, many more conglomerates. Like the most famous companies were corporations that really owned, meaning 51% to 100% of the stock of many, many sub-corporations. So, the maker of cars was owned by some higher up corporation, and that higher up corporation also owned lots of other things. And the usual explanation was, it's risk. Like, just in case cars go down, that company up there, you should buy its stock because it's not dependent on the market for cars. They also own airplanes, they own railroads, they own book companies. And so whichever way the market goes, you will diversify your risk by buying stock in this high up corporation that really is, you could think of it as insourcing lots of things. All they need to do is pick the right CEOs of these underlying corporations, and the shareholders will be made better off because they'll diversify their risk. Well, two famous people at our business school showed, not directly, but indirectly, no, that's a bad way to think about it. Because you might really want to buy a car maker, and I might really want to buy a bookmaker. And if somebody else wants to diversify by owning both cars and books, they can do it at home. That's a Levmore expression. They can do it at home. That is, they can buy stock in the bookmaker, they can buy stock in the car maker, and at home, if they could take their stock certificates and mix them up if you want. So at home, they can diversify. They don't need the CEO of some top company to diversify for them. Indeed, if the CEO expands and expands by owning many, many sub-corporations, it'll be very hard to get smaller. It'll be very hard to disaggregate, very hard to undo expansion, as I described in the lecture. And actually, that took hold. I mean, conglomerates have sort of gone out of business, and it's much more like there's somebody who's very good at running something, and they run it. When you choose the University of Chicago Law School, more or less, you don't really care that much whether it has a good math department and a good something else. Even there, you disaggregate. To some extent, you care about the overall aggregated entities into education, but you care much more about the reputation of the lower level thing you go to. And the same is true with investment in corporations. So aggregation has really gone out of style. And I think because of this brilliant theory that people can choose this at home. The original theories developed about debt and equity, something you'll meet later in law school, that you can again choose at home your combination of lending money, borrowing money, investing in stock, and so forth. But it's well applied to all these entities we've talked about. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks.
Great. Ed, how about you?
Thank you, Professor. I just had a quick question. Should certain...
Isn't that against the rules?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Don't we have to see your smiley face?
Oh, okay, you can see me now. I just had a quick question. Should certain firms be less hesitant to expand because maybe they're in an industry where there are a lot of laterals and they might be able to decrease incoming class size if they get too big, as opposed to, schools where the teachers unions are an external force and law school where tenure is something that maybe just makes laterals less of a thing, or families where you can't give away a child because you've exceeded your optimal parenting.
Yeah, so let me add to your question before trying to answer it. Can you hear me okay? Before I continue, I would really feel good if we had more questions on the pipeline. So if there are things that puzzle you or you want to disagree with, like raise your hand, don't be shy. Ooh, that worked right away. Okay, but more questions would be fine. I'll get through them. So first of all, your question's right on target. For example, to add to your question, a very good predictor of the size of the salary of the CEO is the size of the firm. Like the CEO actually seems to have an incentive to grow and grow because their salaries are better measured not by profit on the investment, not by the percentage gain, but rather by the size of the firm. By the way, that's not true of universities. The highest paid university presidents, and as far as I know, the highest paid deans, are not associated with the biggest schools. I mean, there's some connection maybe, but not really much of a connection. So it's more connected with how much is outsourced or insourced and people who are good at that. Okay, and by the way, maybe even the reverse. Like the smaller the staff per capita in many institutions, let's take university, probably the higher paid they are. There's evidence of this. You could see the idea. That's my idea about schools. Like find better people to run, the dean of students office and try to give them more respect and more benefits and maybe even a little more pay. Oh, Charles, I hope you're not listening to this. And that might be a better strategy than having 5 times as many employees at slightly lower pay and lower respect and so forth. So that's a good strategy. But for the CEO outside universities and a few other things, firm size is the best single predictor of income. Under Coase's theory and my interpretation of its modern version, and I think your question, that's very bad because they might have an incentive to grow and grow and grow when in fact it would be optimal both for their investors and for society not to grow. There's some optimal size that might be cool, might be small. They don't appeal to the whole market. So the firm, has to battle this. They really want to think of ways to say to the CEO, even though the more responsibility you have, it's inevitable then that it'll be hard to replace you. We'll have to pay you more. We really don't want you to do that. So we're going to look at things like stock price. And if the stock price rises, then we'll reward you, even though a lot of progressive people won't like that, because we don't want you to think that in order to get a higher salary, you have to be bigger and bigger and bigger. Countries, that's a major problem. Somebody running especially an autocratic government, always thinks, oh, let me just conquer a few countries around me, then I'll get bigger and bigger. And it's like fun to have more power. I will get paid more, so to speak. Like it's easier to be corrupt, the harder it is for people to monitor me and the bigger it is. Presumably, if you're the voter, you really want to try to discourage that. You would like to, have a UN that tried to say boundaries of countries are really fixed. We don't really want them to grow. And I think the world has been pretty successful about that. Countries switched sizes much, much more in the 19th century than they did in the 20th and now the 21st century. I think that's all in response to your question. Like we want to disabuse them of the idea that they should grow and grow, and that's the only way they will be rewarded. So I think I'm getting at your question. If not, you'll ask me a follow-up. That is, it is a problem that the incentives that are faced internally might not be the same as what we want externally. I have one more thing to say about that, but first tell me if I'm directing my answer towards your question or I'm on the wrong path.
So you're kind of on the right path, but I guess the question was more so that a parent is going to stop short and have 2 kids, even though their optimal parenting capacity is 3 kids.
Let's quote you on this, not me, because I don't. Okay.
But that's an appropriate hesitation to have, right, for a parent, because if you have 4 kids, you can't give away 1. But for a law firm,
same with spouses, I hear.
Right. But for a law firm or just, I guess, a typical company that maybe doesn't have the constraints of a union, should they be as hesitant, considering that if they go over that optimal amount and they want to return back to it, it would be easier for them to do so?
Well, I'm not sure why it would be easier for them to do so. It's really very unusual for companies to shrink. It's almost unheard of for universities to shrink unless they're going broke. It's almost unheard of for families to shrink. The family might disassemble, that is, parents might get divorced and so forth, but it's very unusual for the family to shrink in, more obvious fashions. It's extremely unusual for religions to shrink. They think they should be measured by how many adherents they have. And it's true, there are occasionally breakaway religions, but that's generally regarded as a failure. Again, Coase might say, that's not a failure, that's a sign of success. It's like different preferences are being expressed in these different religions. You should celebrate the fact that people moved away from your religion and formed another one that had longer prayer or this or that. No, that doesn't seem to be the way the world works. People seem to measure success by how crowded they are, so to speak. It might be healthy and it might be unhealthy, again, in Coasean terms. I think, you already know what I'm going to say, I think it's more the case when it's hard to measure success. Like in I think that's the difference between the 8th grade teacher and the judge. We don't know in advance who will make a good judge. So we sort of give them an equal workload. Once they're on the job for 15 years, the only way we can reward them for their excellent decisions is to put them in the case books you get in law school, or to follow their precedents a little more. We're not allowed to pay them more. Maybe we can promote a few of them, but that's really about it. If only we could identify them very early and we had a system where you could reward them, that's unlikely in our political system. By the way, in Japan and a few other countries, they claim to be doing that, although the literature shows that it's more political. They claim, the better you are as a judge, the more we'll move you to Tokyo, where apparently everybody wants to live and the schools are better for their kids and so forth. Italy is a little bit like that. Most countries, if you're a bad judge, which modern world understands as you don't do what the government wants you to do, they send you way out to the Hicks, or whatever word they use. I used to know this word, but whatever word they use in Japanese. So that is a common method of, doing things. We don't do that in the United States. We don't say to people on the 8th Circuit, you're doing a really good job. We're going to move you to the DC Circuit, where you get much more important cases about the administrative state. Again, it would be very interesting if we did that. But part of it is we don't know what it means to be a very good judge on the 8th Circuit. Different people will think different judges are great. So I think that's sort of the real answer, is that it depends on whether you think we're good at evaluating who's really good and who's really bad on the job. Conley, I think I have you next on my list.
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. Thanks for the talk. It's very interesting. I'm wondering kind of how this relates to the size of legislative bodies. Like you could say, like the U.S. House of Representatives, you might say that it's like currently too small to adequately represent like all the interests of everyone. And it seems like to me that would create costs, like it's more expensive to respond to 2 million constituents versus just like 2,000. And so I wonder if I'm wondering your thoughts on this, on whether that is the failure to expand, like the House, is due just to political inertia, or is there kind of some Coasean issues at play here?
Okay, that's interesting. I'd love to tie this to Coase and not to have it express any political preference of mine, but it's very hard to do that. I mean, let's just go over the problems with doing that. One is that we're never going to have enough, members of Congress to satisfy everybody's preferences. Like that would require practically one congressperson per family or per neighborhood. There are countries that come pretty close to that, as you know. I mean, the EU has an enormous number of representatives, even on a per capita basis. Germany has a lot of representatives. You might say that we have a lot, if you count aldermen in Chicago as a representative. I know that's not national, but they can exert some power and so forth. Also, it's not clear that if we had fewer members of Congress, they would be of higher quality. That is, that's back to my question of, do you think we can identify the good quality and the bad quality? It would be super fun. So here's this is a paper for you to write. I think it'd be really interesting if instead of requiring, members of the House and the Senate to be resident in their district, it'd be really good if it was the opposite. Like if you see a really good congressperson in New York, you should be able to hire them here. And maybe Pittsburgh will hire them too. And then that person will get 3 votes in Congress. In other words, if people express, wow, that person's of really good quality, their values really represent me, why should they have 3 votes if 3 jurisdictions would vote for them? I'm being serious here. I don't think that's such a crazy idea. Just like all 3 districts can, buy McDonald's food, why can't all 3 districts, have the same representative? And that might be a measure of quality. Again, we don't allow that because we're smitten by your idea that somehow the person that has the most in common with you, they live in your neighborhood, is your best representative. I really don't see that. I mean, that's not my view of how politics works. I think you watch them in action, you see their votes, you see their speeches, and then you get a sense of, do I like that congressperson or not? We allow you to give money to people who are running for office in Louisiana. I'm not sure we should allow that in our system, but we do allow that. So if so, why not vote for them and have them represent you and give them an extra vote in the House or the Senate? So I think that's where your question is leading. I don't think it has to do with the number of representatives, because I don't think you can evaluate good and bad. If you could, then go ahead. then go ahead and allow them to represent you, give them 3 votes and so forth. I mean, maybe another way to think of it, your question was to say, who do you have more respect for, the Senate or the House? I think you're saying the House, because your individual congressperson is more likely to resemble your preferences or your life or whatever, since there are more of them. I find that hard to believe. I think most people think that the Senate, this is not political about what you think today. This is what you think over 20 years. I think most people think that the Senate is better than the House, has better ideas, is more prestigious, is more whatever. I suspect that you would rather be elected to the Senate than you would rather be elected to the House, because the perception would be, oh, only 2 people representing a state, he must be really good. So I guess I just don't, buy the general intuition that the more Congress people we had, the better we would think they were, and so forth. Angela, I thought you had your hand up and you went away. Am I missing something?
I did for a second. Ignore the background. Long story.
Okay. Long stories are good. It's also Coase.
Do we think that the optimal size for firms, corporations, countries varies depending on the time that we're in and consumer preferences of those time periods? Like now we will see like craft breweries like being niche and being small is very in fashion compared to a couple years ago, well, more than a couple. So would that make the optimal size shift to smaller or?
Okay, so it's a great question. So let me repeat the question as I understand it. It's over time we seem to see more specialization in some industries, like craft brewery. I won't tell your parents that you're obsessed with alcohol. Don't worry about it. And then other industries, we don't see that. So maybe it shows that optimal size changes over time. I have a theory about this. First of all, of course, I agree. Optimal size of firms and maybe even law schools changes over time. I think it's about wealth. That is, the wealthier the country, the less you'd think it would care about economies of scale, and the more it can afford to satisfy individual tastes. So, it's cheaper, so to speak, to have Miller Lite, sold all over the country and have just one kind of beer. And then we can produce the beer at lower cost and deliver it with one truck rather than 11 trucks coming from different breweries. So if you're a poor country, you'd expect to have fewer beers. But if you can afford to pay for more beers at higher price, you'd expect to have more beers as the country gets richer, because people are willing to pay more for, a different kind of beer. So I think that more or less that style of thinking explains where we have more specialization. A richer country, I'll go all the way here. Are you ready? A richer country probably has more religions on average. How's that for, going out on a limb? It can afford to have lots and lots of buildings and lots of people with different pastors and all that. There aren't a lot of poor countries that have, 20 religions or whatever. I think it is a kind of economy of scale, preference thing, community feeling thing, or whatever. There are exceptions, obviously. There are a lot of counterexamples. I mean, we remain a pretty wealthy country, but, Facebook has captured a huge share of the market. It's not true that the richer the country, the more competitors Facebook has, so to speak. That doesn't seem to be connected. That seems more about, groups you want to be in contact with and so forth. But I agree. Certainly over time, as preferences change, the optimal size of entities will change. No question about it. If electric cars become really the thing, autonomous vehicles become the thing, I think over time, we probably will expect fewer producers than we do now, because the thing they'll most have in common is the efficiency and the accident avoidance of autonomous cars. It'll be very hard in your garage to make your own autonomous car. But, I could be wrong about that. It could be that people will have very different preferences about them. Notice some things seem very sticky. We have about the same number of same number of universities we had in the past, more or less the same number of political parties we had in the past. There's some things that seem very sticky. We have other explanations for them. A lot of it is preference revelation. I don't know whether I think we have more kinds of music that are popular than in the past. That's probably also a wealth effect. I don't know. I mean, this is, we certainly, this is not my area of expertise. We, in a sense, have more kinds of families, more kinds of couples, more kinds of, what do you call the groups we have? Affinity groups in the law school. Like, is that related to preferences? Is that related to size? Is it related to wealth? Is it related to other things? I'm not really sure, like, what explains the optimal size of an affinity group. I bet Coase, if he were here, would have a very strong view about it, but I'm not sure. I have to think about it. Thank you. Logan, I've skipped you over. Are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
I'm just curious what Coase would say about certain industries that have very strong economies of scale, right? Like we see very, very few small airline or cellular industries, or also industries where, the value of growth is good just because of what it signals to the stock market. Like Uber has been operating at a loss for years and years and years, and yet continues to grow because that signals strength in future investment. Are those exceptions, or are those built into the Coase theory?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much. First of all, I'm not saying, and I don't think Coase was saying that, the inside-outside costs, as I've described it, is the sole explanation for firm size. I tried to give the military defense as a counterexample. I think countries are of a size that has much more to do with defending their borders. After all, internally, they can have a bunch of states and a bunch of preferences satisfied. So I'm not claiming, nor did Coase claim, that Coase's great idea explained everything about size. So, of course, economies of scale make a huge difference. There are some things that you can just make cheaper and cheaper and cheaper if you make them very large. And therefore, we all have, there's one water supply system in Chicago. It's, hugely expensive to dig up the street many times, to have many, many items out in Lake Michigan, gathering up the water and purifying it. It makes a lot of sense to have one water supply. In this case, it's government controlled, as are many firms like that, because there's lack of competition and so forth. So I'm conceding that, and in that sense, I'm disagreeing with the question away. Like, I'm not claiming that it's all one explanation. Still, you're being provocative. Uber is provocative, as always. I don't see the world the same way you do. Like, first of all, I think Uber, maybe like Facebook in the old days, certainly like Amazon, I think one way to think about Uber is that it's very profitable. That is, it's true that if you owned Uber, so to speak, you wouldn't make a lot of money right now. Maybe they'll figure out a way to advertise and make money, whatever. But if you counted the income of all the people who drive for Uber, a lot of them are made much, much better off. They have part-time jobs they never had before. Now they can afford cars and so forth. So maybe the real owners of Uber are all of us who drive, who take Uber trips, and maybe next to us or above us are all the people who drive for Uber, who are making their own personal choices about whether to be Uber drivers or not. Uber is just an intermediary that says, oh, I see a lot of you want to drive cars in your spare time and make a little money on the side, or enough money to buy a car. Even if you're not making money profit, you can now afford a car. So, okay, I'll be an intermediary that allows you to do that. Every time I lose money, I guess I'll have to raise the take that I get from the drivers so that I'll sort of break even, or maybe eventually I'll make the drivers own Uber itself. So I think Uber is very profitable in that sense. Now, it could be more profitable. That is, you might own Uber and lose money seeing all these drivers, and you might think, I want to hang on to Uber because, like Facebook or like Amazon, it might eventually really make a lot of money. Like, it might dominate the market, start advertising in Uber cars. I might really be sitting on top of billions of dollars if I just wait and be patient. So I don't know what they're thinking. I would buy stock in Uber, wouldn't you?
Debatable. Post-COVID, definitely.
All right. So you see, even though Uber is said to lose money, we think it's actually pretty attractive. So, and it does have competitors, of course. doesn't really have competitors, right? Like a lot of these drivers drive for Uber, Lyft, and so forth, which again feeds my view of Uber that really it's owned by the drivers in some manner of speaking. So I don't know, I mean, maybe it flips the question a little bit that we have to think about who really owns. Like, ask yourself this question, like who owns our law school? Like it's a nonprofit. I'm into nonprofit law. Nobody in a way owns it. It's a nonprofit, but do you want to think of the faculty as owning it because they have votes on things? Do you want to think of the board of trustees as owning it? They don't get paid. Do you want to think of students as owning it, of alumni owning it? Like it's very complicated who owns it. We want you to feel like you own it, right? We want you to come here and pay us money that doesn't match the cost of educating you. But we then want you to, we're hoping you'll give money after you graduate because you'll feel a sort of ownership interest or family interest in it. So in a lot of these entities, it's kind of confusing who owns it. You're free to reject it. You're free to own it. We want you to feel like it's an improvement to your life or to society or something. Same thing with families. If my kids run up big debts, they're now, over 18, I don't have to pay their debts. Nevertheless, I probably would. Like I think the family unit, I don't own it, but I feel a sort of relationship to it as I do to the University of Chicago Law School. So I feel like the question, I think this is why you mean it, it's a little bit beside the point. It's like hard to identify what the organization is and what its size is. Some of us, maybe most of us, we don't really want the University of Chicago Law School to grow. Like maybe we want more applicants and then we want to be even more selective in choosing them. But growth is not our goal. It's like reputation is our goal or something. And maybe that is or isn't like Uber. Raz?
Thank you. I'm risking a dangerous question, I think.
Oh, dangerous is the best. There are no such things as dangerous questions. How are you? Did you know that I saw you on the street the other day and waved?
Yeah, I waved at you.
Because masks are very complicated.
I can't see anything with the mask and the glasses. Everything becomes
like
shady.
To me. Okay.
Yeah. I wonder to what extent Coase's notion that transaction cost and quite frankly money explains the method of production, either through a centralized firm or through outsourcing of, products like Wikipedia or Linux, in which the production is not done by a firm. It is done by a multitude of different individuals. It seems that in such industries, the transaction costs are quite high. The coordination effort between, so I'm not sure what I'm thinking about that. But
and therefore, you'd expect it to be smaller or bigger?
Different, I think, mainly. Probably smaller.
Okay, well, I think I'm very involved with Wikipedia, so let's take that as an example. So I don't think the transactions costs are that high in the sense that nobody forces you to give Wikipedia money and nobody forces you to edit or create Wikipedia pages. So I guess we could call that high transaction cost. I spend time creating Wikipedia pages, but it's kind of a sport for me. It's fun. Any more than saying that running on the lakefront is high transactions cost. It's voluntary, therefore it's not high cost. It gives me pleasure to do both. So I don't want to think of that as high transactions cost, which leads us to wonder about Wikipedia's size. Again, I don't think Coase is so relevant. I think our previous questions indicate that. Like Wikipedia is especially valuable the more people contribute to it, the more entrants it has, the more it's available in multiple languages. That's what they now raise money for, to make it available in many languages to poor people who don't contribute to it and so forth. So I don't think Coase explains Wikipedia very well. That is, or another way to say it is, Wikipedia grows and grows, and it doesn't have high transactions cost inside the firm. Like inside the firm is part of the sport. You can go repair a Wikipedia page at no cost to you other than as a sport. I don't know if you've tried to do that, but it's very, very low cost. And of course, Wikipedia has its own bots that repair Wikipedia pages. If it were expensive to do it, if Wikipedia made it a hurdle to sort of get in there and repair false information, then it might be that we would find many competitors to Wikipedia, which would sort of be a shame because obviously each one would be a little bit inferior. But let me give you a counterexample before we really wind down. The counterexample is language. So one way to look at it, I mean, if I came from your country, I would say, come on, English is like the dominant international language. English has grown and grown and grown, and you basically can't do a lot of activities unless you speak English. You know, we have some competitors. You know, Mandarin is a significant competitor, but Hebrew is not a competitor. Like, it's, for people who live in a Hebrew society, it's charming to speak Hebrew. It has a history, it has some books and all that aren't perfectly translated. But to most of us, it's a sport. Like, you don't see a lot of Americans running to university to take Hebrew in order to enjoy the novels. So that's an example like Wikipedia, where one language seems to dominate. It is because of high transactions cost of outsourcing. Like, it's expensive. It's inefficient, so to speak, to have 15 dominant languages, so you can't really make friends abroad, and you certainly can't have relationships with people abroad the way they did in the old days. I mean, it's a big advance in the world that one language became Wikipedia, so forth. Again, I think that is convincingly explained by Coase. Like, it's explaining the internal costs compared to the external costs. The external costs were very high. Therefore, one or maybe two languages really grew and grew. And the only reason the other ones survive is it's kind of a hobby. Like, it's kind of cool to speak some language that very few other people speak, and you have something in common, and you have, you know, books and, you know, making food in common or something. And people like their own cultures. I'm not, you know, diminishing it, but it's not because of they know they have high transaction costs. That proves that they really like it. They're spending money learning their own languages and so forth. We have time for one last question, and Sojung, I think it's yours. I promise a quick answer because I know I need to finish at 1:20.
Great. So as advertised in the posting, we were going to talk about cities in addition to nations. So I was just wondering, like, do you think major cities like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, DC, whatever, would be more like the firm and the business where it's easier to see what the internal costs are, or more like some of the other groups we talked about where that Coase might not actually apply as well? Because like cities have large municipal departments and spread, but that leads to its own problems.
Yeah, okay, I don't mind. I'm flattered that you accused me of false advertising. That's perfectly okay. So the reason I didn't go to cities was we sort of had questions that were related to cities. It's like inside the nation, you can have some diversity, you can appeal to different tastes, and there's a lot of theory about this as you'll learn in other courses. So it's not just states, it's cities. If you want to live in a crowded place with a lot of museums, then you go live in Chicago or New York or whatever. But if you like the countryside, you go live somewhere else. So cities are a way of offering people things inside that is a kind of diversity. It does not seem to me have much to do with transactions costs. Like for the city of Chicago to grow, it has significant transactions costs. I mean, famously, we have to monitor the police. We have to monitor, you know, firefighters. I mean, firefighters are actually a very interesting example, but there the growth is mostly the economy of scale. There are many areas. I lived in Virginia, and the town outside of Charlottesville had a contract with Charlottesville that they used the Charlottesville firefighting. Like there, the economy of scale was great. It didn't pay to have your own internal fire department. But for some things, it does pay. You could think of neighborhoods within a city as an example of this. Like we have different neighborhoods in Chicago. They don't have their own firefighting police forces and things like that, but they do have their own entities, maybe restaurants and things like that. I don't think it's really Coase. I mean, I don't think it's about internal costs and external costs. I think it's more about preferences. Like as the society is richer, it can afford to satisfy many, many preferences. You go to a rich school, they're likely to have more sports teams than a small school. You know, again, I don't think it's about Coase. There's a cost to having each team, but the richer the society and the richer the people who go to that school, the more they can afford to have, you know, 7 kinds of hockey teams or whatever. So thank you very much. Those who didn't get to ask a question that wanted to, I'm super happy to take emails. Don't be shy. I try to respond to them within a few minutes. I admire you for coming to CBIs. I don't think I was as mature and hungry for education when I was in your role. So I really admire you, and thank you very much for coming.